Welcome to the James Jones Sutherland Theatre at the Sydney Opera House. For today's discussion on Australian food, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're on the site of one of the earliest middens representing the traditional food culture of Australia back to the earliest times. I'd also like to acknowledge that we meet on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present. We all in Australia know Bill Granger. When I say his name, you probably already have an image of him in your mind, and perhaps it's an image of scrambled eggs. I'd like to introduce Bill today, however, in the words of others. Apologies in advance, it's a fairly long introduction, but people have said an awful lot about him. Nearly 20 years ago, the New York Times wrote about Bill's scrambled eggs, that they would stack up against all comers, including the likes of Julia Child or Michel Girard, one of the founding fathers of French Nouvelle Cuisine. In 2009, the Sydney Morning Herald's Terry Durack said, "Every city has a cafe that is the poster child for the city's inner spirit, and for Sydney, it's Bill's." UK's Telegraph magazine called him the king of breakfast, and not as a metaphor. They capitalised the K in king, and that's in a country that knows an awful lot about monarchies. In 2016, Condé Nast wrote that Bill launched a whole new style of eating in Australia. The New Yorker said that Bill Granger is the restaurateur most responsible for the Australian cafe's global reach. But I think in 2019, the New York Times perhaps said it most simply. It said, "Bill Granger reinvented the image of Australian food as seen from abroad." Bill's eponymous cafe brought us corn fritters, ricotta hotcakes, honeycomb butter, of course, those scrambled eggs, and one dish that has now become perhaps even more ubiquitous. And for that, I want to take you back to 1993. It's a fair while ago. Rodney King riots were going in Los Angeles. Sleepless in Seattle was the top of the global box office. Monica Seles had been stabbed by a spectator in Hamburg. Mandela and de Klerk dismantled apartheid in South Africa, and they won the Nobel Peace Prize. Yet something perhaps not quite as momentous, but equally interesting, was happening just a few kilometres away from here in Sydney's Darlinghurst. The man on my left, Bill Granger, put avocado toast on the menu at Bill's. Bill, welcome to the Sydney Opera House.
Oh, thank you, Adam.
In your new book, Australian Food, you talk about how your kids sometimes roll their eyes when people say that you invented avocado toast. But did you?
I don't like the word invented. I think there might be a lot of people in Mexico who might put avocado on bread before me. But I think at Bill's, it popularised the idea of going out for breakfast and having it. And I think, it was an upgrade for me on Vegemite toast, right, which I love, being an Australian, having that savoury breakfast.
Avocado toast has certainly had a moment in the 30-odd years since that time. But before we get to that, let's talk about the empire. Let's talk about Bill's, not just the man, but also the would you call it an empire?
No, I don't know. They're just my restaurants, they're home. It's quite hard with the restaurants every time you walk in. And I was in the Darlinghurst restaurant this morning early before we opened. And they're also personal. They're like an extension. They're like rooms in my house. So, yeah.
How many rooms are in that house right now?
Oh, 19.
19?
Yes,
Spread
19.
Across Australia, Japan,
Hawaii.
New York, Hawaii.
Yeah, and London and Seoul.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
And I would say, perhaps not unfairly, that you came to becoming a restaurateur through a fairly unconventional path.
Oh, absolutely. I had no thought of going into the restaurant business. My family were shopkeepers. I was born behind a butcher shop. My father had his first butcher shop, I think at 22 or 3. And we lived behind there, and I remember the sawdust on the floor. And shopkeeping was very much a part of my life. My grandfather had butcher shops, and I'd walk in, and I always remember I love the social nature of it, the camaraderie with the butchers that have a chat. There would always be silly jokes. Butchers have a sort of secret language. And then the customers coming in. And I went to art school thinking I'd wanted to do something creative. I started architecture in Melbourne. It was too disciplined for me. I was just too structured. It wasn't me. And then I went and studied art in Sydney. I moved to Sydney and studied art and started working in a restaurant part-time. And that was it. I fell in love with the restaurant business.
How do you then make, I'm sure there is a lot of art students out there that don't make the leap from art student to restaurateur. Well, how does that spark hit you? You walk into Darlinghurst and you go, that's the building we want to open. what will become one of the most iconic cafes in the world.
It definitely wasn't the building I went like that. It was the only building I could get. I'd tried a site in Ultimo. I tried to get near the ABC headquarters. I was about to move down there, and then I'd tried one in Bondi, and no one would rent me a space because I was so young. And the site I eventually got was in Darlinghurst. And the man who owned it had bought this building. He was got to set his girlfriend up in a little cafe in there. And they'd broken up, luckily for me. And it had been empty for a year. And I got it for $250 a week because he was desperate.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's the only way So that didn't last too long, but it was a great way to start.
Let's talk about Australian cafe culture a little bit, because I don't think we can downplay just how extraordinary the influence of Bill's and other restaurants like it has been around the world. You know, for years we've been talking back and forth about Australian food. You know, what is Australian food? What does it represent? And for all that time that we've been having this discussion, you've been opening restaurants around the world on the basis that they are serving Australian food. You know, you can go to New York, Los Angeles, Tokyo. These days, young people that go abroad from Australia are going abroad to open cafes to serve flat whites. If you go to China and order a flat white, you order a ao bai, which means Australian white. You know, a lot of that is due to Jackie Yuen and then the Waggas chain over there. Do you think Bill's was one of the first Australian cafes?
I think so. When you say Australian cafe, definitely Australian. When I grew up, we always went to Pellegrini's in Melbourne, and in Fitzroy Street there was, we used to go to a restaurant there. But being in Melbourne was that Italian coffee. We went for Italian coffee.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I grew up in Adelaide, and it's the same. Every cafe you went to was a Buongiorno, a Mondiale, a Paesano, Rosati, D'Estasio, these kind of Italian names. And from that Italian cafe culture that I think was probably a little bit stronger in places like Adelaide and Melbourne.
Yep.
You came up to Sydney and you did something different.
I did something different. There was Caluzzi here, and I think every city had one of those great Italian cafes, you know, Bar Italia in Soho in London, you know, and there was another great one in New York. But those classic Italian cafes, I moved to Sydney and I fell in love with the light, because coming from Melbourne is really European focused. You know, it's the Paris end of Collins Street. You wanted to be European and worldly. But coming to Sydney, I fell in love with the light and just the external nature of the city, and it seduced me, and the colours. And I wanted to do a restaurant. I was obsessed with design still, because I wanted to do architecture. And it was the early 90s, and it was minimalism. To me, you know, people like John Purcell and Claudel Silverstone and Donald Judd were all the artists and architects I was really inspired by. So I just wanted to do something very simple and very clean. I didn't even think of making it Australian. I just wanted to make it what I liked, and designed restaurants. Designed restaurants were a new thing in the early 90s. You know, I think Neil Perry had the first design restaurant with Rockpool. But apart from that, there wasn't a lot. So I wanted to bring design with food.
It's kind of groundbreaking. You know, I don't want to...
Thank you.
be too effusive, but I probably should be. But it's at that vanguard where you've gone from this idea of what a cafe should be. It was very much, take something from Italy and you put it into, a street in Melbourne or Sydney or Adelaide, and then all of a sudden, this restaurant that you've created appears. What was at the front of your mind? Was it just the design first, and then creating an aesthetic and creating, I guess, a feeling or a moment around it, or was it about, we need to find somewhere that's going to sell some really nice eggs?
No, never about business. And I think that's the thing with restaurants. I think you could never think, no one in the restaurant business will tell you should go into the restaurant business wanting to make money, because it's not probably the best way to start. You go in there because I wanted to go in there to express myself. So whether it was expressing myself in art, I really felt a desire to creatively express what I loved. And that was with food and interior design and just the whole package. Creating an environment. I love environments, and that's what I love about. And I've always loved restaurants. Growing from Melbourne, I had my 18th birthday at Stephanie's. I'd picked which restaurant I wanted to go to. I was obsessed by the glamour and the way they made you feel. So it was just about expressing myself, to do a great creative job.
Do you think that aesthetic has been the secret to your success? Because when I think of Bill Granger's food, I don't picture a chef under fluoro lights at the back of a windowless kitchen. I picture a plate of your food on blonde wood by a window,
Yeah.
and there's a colour scheme to it. You know, there's yellows, there's bright whites. You know, there's a look to your food that came in 25 years before Instagram.
Yes, and I often think now, because I try to be better at Instagram, I'm not so great at it, but I often think we used to always joke, Michelle, who was the first chef, and I said, oh, where's Vogue when you want them? We'd be playing with some food and everything. She was an ex-art student as well, and you'd be rolling out pastry or, you know, slicing fresh peaches or doing something. Because food, for me, when I cook, it's the process of it. I love the visual of food. So whether it's, you know, when you go to a market and you see something beautiful and you bring it home and you put it on your bench, you arrange it in your fridge. I love that whole process, the visuals of food from the start to the finish.
Let's go back to avocado toast for a second here, and only because I think that it's really useful to see the cultural context of foods. You know, and if you were to deconstruct avocado toast, I think it illustrates an awful lot about the moment in 1993 when you went from a pre-avocado toast Australia to a post-avocado toast Australia. But you've got avocado, and immediately that kind of says year-round availability. We've got Australian avocados are produced year-round. We've got a middle-class population that is able to afford them because they're not the cheapest things in the world. We have sourdough. You know, this is another big department. We talk about sourdough. If you go to a cafe that doesn't have sourdough now, it's the outlier. But back in 1993, you having something that wasn't focaccia was the outlier.
And I deliberately wanted to do no focaccia because that's all you could get at, you know, Bartoluzzi or Tropicana was focaccia.
You sure you weren't going to do an avocado toast with sun-dried tomatoes and chicken on a focaccia?
No, definitely not. Yeah, no, and I'm a sun-dried tomato kid. I had to go to Balmain to get the bread. There was one great French bakery then, and I had to beg her, and she was this wonderful, Miriam I think her name was, and she was a wonderful French baker, but she was really tough and strict about not delivering. So I had to beg her, and she finally delivered. So that's how we got the bread, because it was the most important thing.
And then on your avocado toast, you've got chili flakes as well, and there's very few places in the Anglosphere where you can do that, literally outside of Sydney. You know, if you were doing avocado toast in England, for example, where it wouldn't work because they don't have year-round production of avocados, et cetera, you wouldn't put chili flakes on it, but you would do that in Sydney.
Yeah, and I don't think I would have even done it in Melbourne because for me, coming to Sydney and seeing, you know, going to, in those days, Barbecue King late or Golden Century or Thai food in the early 90s and late 80s really started to take off. And I think just that clarity of Sydney food and the spice really made sense here.
The next part of the avocado toast I'd like to talk about is essentially the gap in the market. You know, you've got brunch. For brunch to exist, you need to have, firstly, people who have the time to have it. So generally, somewhere like Darlinghurst, you've got young families or couples or singles for whom going out for breakfast at 9 o'clock is too early, probably can't wait for a 1 o'clock lunch. You know, it's a dish that kind of suits the exact location of that very first build.
Yeah, in the early 90s in Sydney, it's a very different city now. Sydney was quite bohemian, especially in Darlinghurst. It was still, I went to City Art and then, you know, did classes at the National Art School, and there was lots of creativity, and it was a very artistic, creative area. So we had, you know, Baz Luhrmann at the time had his studios up the road or his offices up the road. There was just great people around. So lots of creatives who didn't have to work a 9 to 5, who'd be freelance, designers, all of those people. They were and in a way, the original idea of people working remotely. Yeah, on locations, different times. They could come in and use it as their office, as their meeting space. There wasn't a nightclub.
And then there's also this idea of casualness around it. You know, it's not a fussy dish. None of the food that you were serving at Bill's back at that stage and still serving today is particularly fussy. It is things that people want to eat. Avocado on toast, scrambled eggs. How different was that in 1993 to the idea of what a restaurant should be?
It's quite interesting. Casualness was something that came when I moved to Sydney. I remember coming up for the weekend. I was 18 or 19 and coming from Melbourne. You know, Melbourne is, and I'd worked at a department store called George's in Melbourne, and Melbourne people really prided themselves on their fashion and their look. And I came up in a shirt and a pair of trousers, and someone said, "You can tell you're not from Sydney." And I think in moving to Sydney, I think within 6 months, all I wore were white T-shirts. And I remember going to America on a big trip to look around, and I bought packs of White Hanes T-shirts for about $3 each and just lived in those. And I think Sydney was the casualness, and that felt quite Australian. You know, Sydney, even though everyone thought of the beaches and doing it, it was pre-surf culture, really. There wasn't a lot of that big noise around surf culture for the city. Dare Jennings had Mambo down the road, so he was starting to do things in the early 90s. But it wasn't really a big thing. But I just felt it's the temperature. It's this, it's the sultriness of Sydney makes it casual but also glamorous. And it was a time of great architects doing very simple interiors. And I think we'd all just our eyes changed.
Do you think you kind of had an advantage on that? I often think that one of the big advantages of multiculturalism is that you get people coming and seeing what your place is like firsthand. And you're kind of a multicultural import from Melbourne to Sydney. You came to Sydney with a Melbourne mentality and saw you could easily see those differences between the two places.
Completely. And absolutely want to go down now. There's less of a difference now, I think, just because of everywhere in the world, there's less of a difference. But it still has Sydney, you get up early. I'm shocked when I'm at Bondi Beach at 6 a.m. It's like, whoa, where are all these people from?
Back to the avocado toast. I think the genius of your avocado toast was you took something that was very, very simple, avocado toast, and then you applied something to it that was, frankly, impossible for the average person, which is a poached egg. Nobody in Australia knows how to poach an egg.
Yeah.
And so if you serve avocado toast without a poached egg, everyone's like, I'm not paying $12 for that, $16 for that, $25 for that, however much avocado toast is these days. But you put a poached egg on it and all of a sudden it's brunch.
And the poached egg came around because I only ever did scrambled eggs at the start. And the avocado toast, to be honest, didn't take off. I mean, we've been in business 28 years. Didn't take off for about 15 years. It was only in the late 90s. Suddenly it's like, why is this selling? And the poached eggs were for me to get that extra protein hit. I love eggs. And it was just to have that extra bit of protein to keep you going. And that's how that happened.
I think the timing of it's quite interesting as well. You're looking at a shift away from processed food, people becoming more interested in their food from a health perspective, which, to be honest, through the 80s, there probably wasn't a huge amount of.
No.
Certainly not scientifically driven, probably more marketing driven. In that respect, people are starting to understand the difference between good fats and not so good fats and that kind of thing. How do you get it right? How do you get something like that right? Is there a formula for it?
To make a dish?
Yeah, to get a dish that is going to, not so much one particular dish, but it's the same with the hotcakes, the same with the scrambled eggs. How do you get that to resonate with an audience? If you were serving just Darlinghurst, for example, you can know everybody who walks into your shop by their first name. How do you get a dish to resonate that is going to work in inner city Sydney, is going to work in Tokyo, is going to work in New York, is going to work in London?
Well, it's interesting. I think with signature dishes, and they're often, I think you ask anyone, they didn't know they were going to be signature dish when they started. They just happened, and suddenly it's your customers who tell you what they love. And the great thing about having a restaurant in Sydney at that time was customers were really open. I think if I had been in London or New York, people with traditional, especially cities with histories of long restaurants, or even if I was in Italy or Paris, customers here will try anything. They love things being new. And people often say that about Sydney. It's great, you get the newest, the latest and the greatest, and then we don't get the long-term things. But the flip side of that is it really encourages creativity. You can try and you can push and do different things. I think with a signature dish, you've just got to cook what you like. I mean, for me, it starts what I want to eat myself. And the avocado toast was, for me, putting avocado. It was crushed avocado because I'd stick it on toast. I'd be wanting to eat quickly. I'd do that, and is what I wanted to eat. And I think the health thing is very Sydney. It's the outdoors. It's not wearing, it's having a T-shirt on. You can't cover yourself up as much. So you've got to be a bit health conscious.
I have a slight confession. When Bill's opened in Tokyo, I think it was in Kamakura.
Yes.
I was living in Japan at the time, and we went down there as a sort of a group of Japanese friends and also some Aussie expats that I was and still am friends with. We went down there, and my girlfriend at the time, we went for dinner actually, and my girlfriend at the time had scrambled eggs for dinner because she I was like, "You sure you don't want something else?" And she's like, "No, I'm having the best scrambled eggs in the world at Bill's." What does that make you think of? To think that there is a 20-something person in Japan who is thinking that this man makes the best scrambled eggs in the entire world. And there's not one person, there are millions and millions of people around the world who will look at something as simple as scrambled eggs that many people around the world eat every single day and know that they view you as making the best version of that.
It's pretty wild. I think when we first went to Japan, and I'd lived in Japan when I was a student. I went there for a bit of a gap year and hung around and loved it. And then I worked for a couple of years just going back and forth, doing pop-ups. And finally, and I kept on being asked the question, what is Australian food? Which is a really big question. And, you can say, well, it's sort of like California. It's a mix from everywhere. You really think of it. But part of me realised it's very much about the country, the space. And Kamakura, where the first restaurant was, you mentioned, is by the beach. And you don't think of Japan as having this great sort of beautiful coastline, which of course it does because it's an island. And to me, I went down there, I felt instantly at home. I'd see these sort of hipped out creatives, young families. Everyone was much more relaxed, very different to Tokyo. And I thought, this is where I want to cook. This is where I want to cook what I love. And I got in there, and that's how it started there. And that's, I think when you talked about, you think of not just the food, you think of the colours, the light. For me as well, I've got to be in an environment to cook. Yeah, I like to be barefoot in the kitchen, be surrounded by family. Of course, not always on a beach. I live in London. But I think that idea of communicating Australian food is very much about the country and the location.
Yeah, let's talk about Australian food, because that's the title of your new book. You've gone from your first book being Sydney food to the newest one being Australian food, and in many ways there are quite a few crossover recipes from that very first book into the new one that now under the title of classics. In a lot of ways, I think your idea of Sydney food has become Australian food with a few other things. But if you were not Australian and you were on the outside looking in, you see that the book is full of things like feta and olive oil and yuzu and exo sauce, soba noodles and pasta, and even a version of ka cha, the Vietnamese fish and dill dish from Hanoi. You've got poke bowls and miso and kimchi. What is Australian food? I'm sorry to ask that as an open-ended question.
I think Australian food is, it's a mismatch of food around the world. But we definitely take foods, and I think we take favourite foods. It's because of our, every Australian, when they finish school, saves up to travel. I used to go out while I was working and saving for my $2,000 ticket when I was 18 and sit at Tullamarine Airport with friends and sit at the bar looking at the planes, just dreaming of getting out. And I think that idea of wanting, and we love to travel and we're very outward looking in Australia. I think, we're always trying to understand our place in the world. You often hear about, what's happening in the States or the UK or, Japan, but what's happening here. And I think food has been a really important part of our identity. It has become a very important part of our identity. People travelling and coming back and saying the food's not as good as here. I can't get a coffee. It used to be the thing. Now you can, but 10 or 15 years ago. But I think people want to travel and they bring that food back. And you've got people who travel with Australia on an itinerary and stay. Up in Byron Bay, I've been staying for a couple of weeks. There's so many Japanese who have been travelling and love it. I was talking to a couple and they've got a great Japanese breakfast stall at Byron Bay markets, and they're there and they're raising their kids, and it's huge lines. And I think the idea of Australian food is it's always evolving. I think that's its biggest thing. It's changing. You can't think of the one Australian dish. When I was young, you might think of, a roast lamb and then, maybe a spaghetti bolognese. But, it's changed, and much more than I think any of us could ever imagine how fast it would change. Pasta used to be exotic. My father still won't eat garlic.
Really?
Yeah.
Really? And yet, now you're writing a book with that's called Australian food, and it's got dishes in it like black sticky rice with coconut milk and papaya. You would say that would be a dish that would be quite at home in a book on Thai food.
Yeah, absolutely. But you can go eat it in Sydney. Like I've just been, my daughter now has gone and got cream puffs in Chinatown. We had a Japanese lunch. They'll go and get bubble tea. But anything you want in any city in Australia, you can go and get. You can go to the supermarkets and buy any ingredient, any regional centre. I used to drive up from Melbourne and Sydney when I was 19. I'd stop at a cafe on the way, and they'd have those great espresso machines. And think, I want a coffee. So I think I'll stop and get there. I remember stopping and putting the machine on, steaming the milk, then getting a tin of the Nespresso or whatever, and opening up the tin, doing some instant coffee and pouring in the boiled milk. But of course now you go to anywhere and you can get a decent coffee.
Yeah, Australian cafe culture has become the export of
Yes.
Australian culture and cuisine abroad. This is what we're known for now. We are
Yes.
known for coffee. We are known for avocado toast and scrambled eggs and sourdough. Is that surprising? We often think that maybe Australia should have been fish and chips or meat pies or something like that going overseas, or Vegemite.
Yeah.
But in the end, it's become toast and...
Avocado toast and
Yeah.
a flat white. It's funny, isn't it? I always, thought meat pies was something but of course, pies are from somewhere else, from the UK. But I think it's interesting, opening a cafe, and we've exported Italians with pizzerias or Chinese with, barbecue restaurants. We've exported a lot of people. And what is so good about it is that non-trained people can do it. So you'll often find people who own cafes have had a life change. I'd never really worked in a restaurant. I worked in one cafe, and I opened up, and I could make coffee, I could make a sandwich, so I sort of winged it, and I was a decent home cook. And that's how I did. And I think with most cafes, there's not a lot of opportunities now. People used to have a lot of small businesses, a lot more small businesses. But cafes are still, a great small business. They're a great thing you can open without a ridiculous amount of money, without a ridiculous amount of training. I think with restaurants, everyone thinks they can do every part of it. You wouldn't think I can go make a speedster bike. I know how to do it. But everyone looks at a restaurant and think, hey, they can make a coffee, they can cook, they can serve people. I can do all of that.
Do you consider yourself a chef?
No, definitely not a chef. I think of chefs as, I wouldn't insult chefs with saying I'm a chef. I'm definitely a home cook. I was a good home cook and I loved cooking. I cooked for my family. I had a broken, slightly dysfunctional family like a lot of people. And I found cooking was definitely a way of pulling in the family or creating some focus or some connection with food. So I cook very much for taste and because I like it. I like to eat.
I think in Australia we've in some ways become a little bit, no, not just Australia, the Anglosphere in the world generally has become a lot more concerned with chefs and chef culture and in some cases celebrity chef culture as well. Even something like Michelin, which historically did not look at chefs at all, who was only looking at individual restaurants, is now talking about chefs more than it talks about restaurants. And World 50 Best obviously is something that is, again, supposed to be about restaurants, but is talking about chefs. Yet the people who you would say are the most influential when it comes to shaping the way people cook are cooks.
Yes.
We look at people like yourself, Maggie Beer, Nigella Lawson. What do you think is that kind of difference between, I guess, a chef and a cook? And how does that impact how people cook at home?
I think when you're a chef, and I think of a chef as being very much a beautiful crafts person who's creating a dish, not unlike an artist, for self-expression, to do something because you're feeling it. One of my daughters loves cooking like that. And her cooking's not about feeding other people emotionally, it's about creating it's a creative expression. I think for cooks, the focus is definitely about what do people want to eat. And I think maybe that's been a successful attitude to have in the restaurant, that what do people want to eat? How do I make them feel good? My biggest thing is in a restaurant when you put food down and when someone goes, oh, that looks amazing, or I want to eat that, or I take a photo, it makes people feel good. And I think cooks usually cook for an emotional feedback. Maybe we're a bit more needier as cooks. I think of Ruth Rogers in the River Cafe is another great cook, untrained, but is really good at making people feel welcome. Even Jamie Oliver is really, and he trained for a little bit, but not a long time. He's definitely a cook. He approaches it because he wants to make people happy with food, and I think that's probably the biggest difference.
Your new book is, when you look at the makeup of the recipes, you have some of the classics in there that go back to the very beginning, but what I see when I look at the lineup there, it's very forward with vegetables, Asian influence, Middle Eastern influence, Mediterranean influences, certainly a lot less meat than you would see in a cookbook that you might have written at the beginning.
Yeah.
How do you see Australian food changing?
I think the world's changing, and it's quite interesting. Time and trends and things shift, and I think definitely knowing where our food comes from and the safety of it and the traceability of it will become more important. I think with, bugs, we've been very lucky in Australia. We haven't had big food scares, say in Japan with they've had, dumplings that have been poisoned, or in the UK with mad cow. But I think knowing where your food's from and caring about health will become more important. And I think you're seeing that with chefs. In the last 20, 30 years, writing where things are on menus is, really normal. And I think, restaurants do lead the trends with food. They set the standard, and I think people will be more interested. I think that food needs to be delicious, but people will be wanting to, as we know the world's recipes, and let's face it, we've gone through everything. There's not a lot to discover. It's about creating your own, and what I try to do is create my own versions with a very minimal, simple cupboard, because I am a simple cook, but just how to work out to get an interesting flavour with as little to do with it as possible.
What's at the centre of Bill's, both person and restaurant, as a philosophy about food? Is it about simplicity?
No, it's about community. Yeah, it's about people. So in the restaurants, and we have our restaurants, and that's what was very difficult with COVID, because as a restaurant person, it's quite paternal. You look after your teams and your staff, and it's a big family, and you look after your customers, and you're looking after people every day. If you're only looking after, you can't look after yourself, because no one wants to go to a restaurant that's all about the owner. That's boring. It might be busy for a minute, but it doesn't last. So for me, that's really important. At home, it, for me, creates a balance for the family. A balance, a base for the family. And it's a way when we're busy, all coming together. And as my girls get older now, coming back and rejoining and having that time around the table. And it's connection is what food does for our family.
You, as I do, we both have 3 children. Yours are a little older than mine, but you still cook for your family, don't you?
Oh, absolutely. All the cooking. I do everything. My girls are really busy at school. My eldest is first year university or second year now, and my younger ones are in the last couple of years of school. So they're busy. They're really, really busy, and I want to support them as much as I can. And for me, cooking, I've got to say, when I come home, I try to shop, every second day. I like the switching off. It's my downtime. And cooking, as everyone would know with COVID, you get better. The more you do, the quicker you get, and the more, you just get a lot better at it. So I just like the time. And I like to sort of, go in and make a dish. And sometimes I say, I'm so tired, kids, can we get takeaway? And it's a joke in our house, no one ever lets me get takeaway. Because they said you've spoiled us. So, but then I'll suddenly start, and Bunny, my youngest, will joke that we always know when you're tired, you'll create the craziest meals. You'll have like 20 dishes. I sort of push into it, and suddenly the creativity comes back and the energy comes back. It recharges me.
What advice do you have for home cooks? Because it is something that people struggle with a lot. I think more than is necessary. People are constantly, there's almost a fear about it. How can we make cooking easy? How can we avoid it? How can we make it faster? What can we do to avoid cooking?
Yes.
Essentially. What's your advice?
Well, I think you've got to stop seeing it as a chore. I think that's really, really important. You've got to see it as a bit of a time for yourself. So I think using your hands, and whether it's creating anything, whether it's food, whether it's working in a garden, whatever, is really important for our human condition and to de-stress. It just, we're designed to make things. So doing that is really good, and see it as time for yourself. Put some music on and do it. If you've got younger children, I used to put the kids down when they were little with a plastic tub, a couple of onions, and they'd spend hours, doing that, and then, get them helping. My family's always involved, and I think you should make it a thing you just do yourself. My girls clean up every night. I do all the cooking, and they'll clean up every night. And I think it's planning. If you're nervous, I can cook last minute and go out, but my wife can't. She needs to know in the morning that she's got to get groceries and things. So I think if you need to be organised, just write down what you want to cook and write a plan and make it easy, and don't try and do too much. Maybe one night where you do something a bit more complicated, another night's easy. And I think getting that balance is really important.
Do you make your food look like it does in the restaurant,
Yes.
in the cafe, when you're cooking at home?
Yes, absolutely. I'm lucky enough to go to Japan a lot and travel a lot, and I love ceramics and dishes and the way food, and part of presenting things is putting it on a nice platter and making it look good. And I remember reading one of those silly books you buy about, why, I don't know, maybe Japanese women don't get fat or one of those stupid things. And they were talking about the preparing the bento and the lunchbox and the way you show care and love by making this beautiful thing that someone opens it and sees this care. And I love that. And it's for me as well. I just love the visual. I'm a visual person. I arrange things. It's the way you pile it on the plate. And I think you need to be proud of it and put it all down. We eat family style, put everything in the middle, plates. And I like when the kids notice and make, I still think I get that buzz from it.
I think myself, lived in Japan for a long time. I've also, I guess, been influenced quite a lot by that Japanese minimalist type of aesthetic, particularly when it comes to food. Fancy plating is not really a thing. It is. You take something, you put it on a plate, but you put it on there on a nice plate in a nice way.
Yes.
And you make the food look like you want to eat it.
And it can be very simple. I went to, when I was there and I was curious how Japanese people cook. And Japanese home kitchens are very simple. They have a little grill. They don't have ovens usually, and a couple of hot plates. And I went to a friend's house and he had two little kids, and his wife had just, or Kokobo had made some little hamburger patties they had with a bit of green salad, but some rice, some bought pickles, a bit of bought miso with, bought dashi. Lots of things that all look beautiful. It was a very, very simple meal, but it was just presented with a lot of ritual.
This is the thing that I don't get, and please help me understand it.
Yeah.
We live in a society where things change dramatically and quickly. Aesthetics change. What people want from restaurants change. What people expect when they go out for dinner changes. What we like to wear, what we like to buy changes so much. And yet when I look and contrast Australian food, the latest book, with Sydney food, the book that is nearly 30 years old now, yes, there's parts that change, but I'm amazed at how much of, I guess, the aesthetic and the ethos has stayed the same. This is a fairly long period of time for something to have been, as it has been, constantly successful. You were doing bare tables without fancy tablecloths and communal tables literally 20 years before New Nordic was making it a thing, over in Europe. How do you, I guess, stay up to date, but also how do you make something in such a fast-changing world that is seemingly so evergreen?
I think you've got to be, integrity is really important, and doing what you love and not looking and thinking what the market wants. I think you can't really guess a market. I think you can just do what you like, and hopefully there'll be enough people. Someone once told me that if you know the first 100 customers in your restaurant, you've got a business. And I think that's a really good thing to remember, that if you know 100 of your friends and extended friends and family or work colleagues that will come in, and you're doing what you love, it's really, really important. And the River Cafe is another one that I go there, and it feels so contemporary. It's this room which is, bright blue carpet, incredibly simple. It's been the same for 32 years now, I think. But it still feels contemporary, because I think at the time it was wild and contemporary, and it's not a fashion thing. And I've seen fashions in restaurants goes from minimal, then walls get dark, we get ornamentation. Now restaurants are so designed, they're like theatre sets. I'm sure we're going to go back to simplicity soon enough. But I think if you do what you like all the time, that's what keeps it current. But I think people know integrity. And if you go to, the great European restaurants that have been there for 100 years, the great Italian trattorias, they don't change. They're beautiful, they're comfortable, they're great interiors, but they're not necessarily fashionable. And I think you've got to be careful about making things fashionable, especially in a fast-moving world with Instagram, where things are just zoom around in a minute.
There is a difference though with Bill's, because those great Italian and French restaurants, they stay in one place. But Bill's is something that you've managed to take and transplant from Darlinghurst to Bondi to Kamakura to London. How much of Bill's is, percentage-wise, great food? How much is a lifestyle, and how much is, I guess, brand Australia or brand Bill Granger?
Bill Granger. I think the big one is service and people. That's probably for me the most important thing, the team, because obviously I can't do everything. I learned very early on, once I had more than one restaurant, I couldn't do it all. So it's the people. Interiors are really important because they transport you. So I want to transport people when they come. It's almost, in Japan, it was that idea of going into a holiday. You buy a life for a minute. And I think what happened in Darlinghurst, people had come And someone said to me, or I read something, someone had written that you have a fantasy Sydney life for a minute. And we have a lot of tourists who'd come, and they'd come every morning. And I love that when I travel. I'd find a cafe and just go there every morning because it anchored me and I felt like a local. And I think what I try to do is to make a space that people want to go every day. I do, depending on where I am, I go to the restaurants every day and I sit at the bar and have a coffee, and I just love them. I love sitting in them. What's the thing? I think the Australianness is pretty important, because I think the way we are here is very different in restaurants to the rest of the world. Going to the UK, the friendliness of Australians, the fact that you can say hello to people really easily. In Japan, it was really, really hard at the start, and it's still difficult because we wanted to communicate with the staff to be friendly and warm. But of course, Japanese people are used to a certain service style and a cultural thing. So trying to make Japanese staff open up to other Japanese with smiles and hellos, there's all of those cultural differences. In Britain as well, completely different. We'd get a lot of staff, originally we'd get Londoners, but they were no good. We needed Northerners who were much warmer and bigger and friendlier. And that's what I've spent a lot of time communicating. And also the non-hierarchical nature of our businesses. It's really important that, of course, you need some structure, but everyone has a voice. It's really, really important in the businesses. And I think that's quite an Australian thing.
That's really interesting. We were talking a little bit backstage before we came on about, I guess, interpretation in terms of language. Certain language cues that may mean something literally mean something quite differently the other way. But I'm starting to see now that when you take a concept that is so strong, you can't just plonk it in another place. You have to actually interpret that for the new audience.
Yeah, and you've got to do it, and you've got to be really sensitive where you are. I remember when we first went to Britain, I heard a great story, and someone had said, or had heard, I invited some Australians to come and stay, and they did. And I love that idea that you've just got to be really sensitive and understand what people want and listening. So I spent a lot of time, I lived in Japan for a while. I spent a lot of time there opening and understanding how to do it. And I have the same team who opened the first restaurant now run the business in Japan. It's fantastic. They're all the same staff, and we communicate in our broken Japanese and English. But I think being careful, and the UK is the same, communicating that. The UK is the more the Kate Blanchett Australian, rather, and, we have a laugh. Jason Donovan, who everyone used to joke, we used to get confused with each other. I remember him saying to me once, I was in Ottolenghi the other day and someone said, "Oh, mate, I love your lamb shanks." He said, "I think you got the wrong one." But just getting that right pitch right in the neighbourhoods, and that varies from neighbourhoods. Bondi's a different crowd to Surrey Hills, is a different crowd to Darlinghurst, it all changes.
But we only have a couple of minutes left. I would be remiss if I didn't go to what at least some people at home are going to be thinking about. How do you make a great scrambled eggs? Or hotcakes, ricotta hotcakes.
Oh,
you can
hotcakes.
Choose. I won't make you go through both of them because we only got a couple of minutes.
I think ricotta hotcakes. So ricotta hotcakes, again, from the moment, we had them on a Saturday. We were only open Monday to Saturday when we started, and they were a Saturday breakfast thing, and they became so popular, we had to put them on during the week, and I had to fight with Michelle, the other chef. She said, no. And I said, no, let's do it. And of course, they took off. But I think the secret with the ricotta hotcakes is to use good ricotta. We've always used Pazzanella from the start here. They used to make it a little space in Leichhardt. It's much bigger now. And in Japan, we have a farm who have to make all of our ricotta because we couldn't import enough into Japan. 90% of our sales for many years in Japan were ricotta hotcakes.
Wow.
Yeah. And we started apparently the Omotesando pancake wars, which was crazy, where all these pancakes and then press it, say who's doing the best pancake. But the secret is you need 4 eggs, a big cup of ricotta and some milk, and you just mix it up, being careful not to, and 3/4 cup of milk, being careful not to overmix it. Then just a cup of plain flour, a bit of baking powder, and mix it up lightly, but don't mix the flour through. That's the important thing, as with any baking. You don't want to overmix it. And then, 4 egg whites in there to lighten it up, and that's the souffle style, and folding that through. We have in Japan a whole specialist team of hotcake makers, and we get applications of young Japanese girls who all they want to do is become a hotcake chef. And we said, well, you need to do other things in the kitchen. It's like, no, I only want to do hotcakes. And it's getting that light. So I must say our hotcakes in Japan, I think, are the best anywhere, because there's that idea of craft, that idea of focusing on one thing and making it better. So I think that's the secret. And also having someone else making them for you, I think makes things always taste a lot better.
You just set a light bulb off in my head, because when I first moved to Japan, before Bills was there, Japanese-style souffle pancakes weren't as big a thing now as they were then. Yeah. You know, if your daughters are rolling their eyes about you inventing avocado toast, maybe they're going to roll their eyes doubly when they hear that perhaps you invented the souffle Japanese pancakes that are taking over the world. Bill, we are out of time. We are down to the last few seconds. Thank you so much for being with us today.
It's a pleasure, Adam.
And thank you for introducing the world to Australian cafe culture.
Thank you.